Hi, I'm Aluk Edwardson. I'm the cultural educator, artist, mother, and Arctic person who put this cultural learning resource together. If you'd like to learn more about who I am and the work that I do, please visit www.creativedecolonization.org. This cultural learning resource is going to dive into the work of William Qquilluq, who wrote the People of Kauwerak, Legends of the Northern Eskimo, with the assistance of Laurel Bland. William Qquilluq was told old stories from his grandfather, who he lived with as a young child. He was born in 1869 in Iñupiat, or Point Hope, and moved back to Qquilluq when he was 7. Qquilluq was a village in the central island area of the Seward Peninsula and is where his parents and grandparents were from. William Qquilluq died in 1972. Ancient Inuit used many different skill sets to evolve and become resilient over time. On this slide, we talk a little bit about how ancient Inuit observed the wisdom of non-human life. What ancient Inuit did was they looked around at the animals who were persevering. They learned from them. One of the animals they learned from was the spider. They learned to make a net by looking at a spider's web. Another thing that ancient Inuit observed was a leaf. So perhaps a leaf is not all that exciting in everyday life, but if you are observant, you may notice that when a leaf falls on a lake, and if it has a wind behind it and is the right aerodynamic configuration, that leaf could sail across the water. Meet Qquilluq. Qquilluq was the name of a man of ancient times. His name was given to him by a prophet called Iñuit Prophecies. After the prophet gave him his name, Qquilluq learned many things that would come to pass for his people. The Inuit ancestors, Qquilluq's people, respected Qquilluq a lot because he knew more. He led his people into a better living of their life. Even though these people did not use their minds very much, they knew how to govern themselves. There were no fights among them, and they did not know what war was. Qquilluq was a peaceful person with a friendly manner toward people. He was quiet and always ready to smile or help anyone. Sometimes he wanted to be alone and would work in his mind to think. Sometimes he told people to try to make some things to be useful to them. Other times he made them happy by doing things for them. A long time ago, when Qquilluq was a young man, he always went to watch the animals at the springs that flowed from the mountaintop. It was the place he visited with his father when he was a boy. He approached close to those animals, and yet they did not seem to be afraid of him. Qquilluq went to the place on a warm, sunny day, and like a dream, he saw in a vision all kinds of animals around the spring. He saw all kinds, from an elephant to very small creatures. He was so surprised he stopped. He marveled at what he saw. He said to himself, "Why do I see all these creatures?" Someone answered him. Whoever spoke, it seemed at first that the voice came from very far off. Then it came closer, but the young man could see no one anywhere. There was only a voice that said, "Come here to me." The young man looked around for where the voice came from. He heard, "I am here, Qquilluq." The man looked where the voice was coming from. He saw a bearded and aged old man. His hair was gray, and also his beard. His beard was hanging down. The young man was terrified. He had never seen any man like him. The old man began to talk. He told the young man that the earth would one day begin to shake. He said that after the shaking, this big mountain where they were sitting would soon blow up. He told how all the animals would move to a different part of the world. He said it would get so cold that plants of all kinds would freeze. So we're going to divert from the chronological text here, and we'll talk about communicating in new ways. So the first way that Inuit communicated with each other, according to this ancient history resource, was by smoke signals, by stick waving and waving their parkas. I have heard this from my father, that when you're out hunting, you can wave your arms, you can wave your parka, you can wave a number of things to show people in the distance that you're there. According to this resource, Inuit had special signs that everyone understood, and they could make things known to each other from great distances. Whenever you see water rise, even if it is nice weather then, if the water is real high along the waterline of the big bay or ocean, then it will mean bad weather will come. If a south wind blows, it will mean this high water came with the wind. When the water is low, it means that the northerly wind will blow. When the east wind blows and turns to south wind, it will bring warm weather and rain. When the west wind blows and then turns, and the wind blows to the north, it means dry and clear cold wind and snow in winter. In winter, east wind and west wind usually bring a snowstorm. In summer, the east wind and south wind bring rain and fog. Soon, the winds from the west will become cool. Then the wind will turn to the north. That will be a very cold wind. The east wind will come in wet and bring the rain. Here are a few references to learning from the sun and moon from the people of Kauwerak. The people learned to travel using the sun by day and the stars at night for direction. When a person traveled in the daytime, he looked carefully to the place where he was. He felt where the wind was coming from. When it was stormy, he looked at the blowing snow or into the way the grass was bent by the wind. He also looked to see which way a snowdrift pointed. Next, Iñuit Qquilluq pointed his finger to the sun and to the moon. These two take care of the earth. The sun keeps the cold climate away from this land. In days to come, this western country will depart away very slowly from the sun. The climate will be cold here. The heat of the sun will reach the earth, making a warm climate like you have now. There will be only about 6 months of warm summertime. When the moon is full in April, a notch is cut to show the start of the new year. Every time the moon is full, a new notch is cut on the same edge of the stick. When the next year comes, a new edge of the calendar stick is started. Inuit keep track of the months by the moon, not by the days passing. Tonight, I will show you how to go by the moon and stars to tell weather. You must tell your people about this. Keep this way to tell about the weather the same always. Never change, because the stars never change where they are except 2 stars, and Tuturok, the caribou stars. Iñuit Qquilluq drew a picture in the wet mud by the spring. It looked like what is called the Big Dipper today. He said, "This is Tuturok." Learning from the stars. Regarding Tuturok, or the Big Dipper, as is commonly understood, on the end where the stars make a curve from the 4 in a square, On the end where the stars make a curve from the 4 in a square, the last star points west. It means the night has begun when you see it. When it comes to point straight up to the north, then time has come to midnight, halfway through the nighttime. When it points east, the morning is coming. Also, please remember this is in reference to the northern hemisphere near the poles. Next, Iñuit Qquilluq pointed to 2 stars. If these 2 stars are far apart, the spring weather will be long with good seal hunting. When they are far apart, it means a long spring and a time to go out hunting the sea animals. If those 2 stars are close, it is also good hunting for little fawnskins. You can tell how these stars move by the 3rd little star beside the star on the right. These stars are called Pingasut Toahut, wise men. Look now, you see those stars are very still. That means that you will not have wind. If they are blinking in 1 or 2 days, there will be wind. You watch the clouds. You watch the sun and the moon. You will know what the weather will be by watching them. Watch your stars, and you will learn your weather. Remember this and teach others so they will keep knowledge about how to tell weather from generation to generation. If the moon is quarterly and it dips very low, there will be stormy weather that month. If the moon dips so low, it looks like a bucket of a man who is pouring water out, it means that in the spring there will be lots of sea animals as well as land animals. There will be lots of birds in the air and on the land. When the quarterly moon's dip is very high, upward, that means it will be very dry, good weather. Inuit weather people. In every Inuit village, there was a weather person. This was a person who had studied the weather ever since they were 10 or 12 years old. The weather person watched for the first quarter of the moon. When it appeared, they could tell what the weather would be all through the month. If the face of the first quarter moon leaned toward the earth, there would be wet weather in the summertime. If it was winter, there would be snow. If the moon stood straight up, it meant it would be good weather half of the month and bad weather half of the month. If the quarter moon leaned backward, it meant it would be dry weather until the full moon. The weather person looked into the clouds. They watched to see what way they were sailing. If the cloud sailed from the east, the weather person knew it would be snow or rain. If the cloud sailed from the south, it would be warm weather. When the cloud sailed from the north, the weather person knew it would be very low overcast, and the clouds would break soon, and the sun would appear. If the cloud sailed from the west, it would be windy and blowing strong, but it would be mostly dry weather. I want to take a moment here to show you, the listener, how it's more than one piece of information that the weather person relied on. They looked at Earth as a whole. They looked at the systems around them as connected. They did this in a scientific way and a spiritual way. They had ritual around how they looked at and understood weather and the moon and the stars, and they used what they knew and what they were taught and the observations that they had to inform the community for everything from travel to hunting to celebration. The weather people knew about spring, summer, and winter weather. If the spring season was wet and raining most of the springtime, the middle summer would be good weather. If the middle summer weather was wet, it meant an early fall was coming. If the spring weather was cold, that meant there would be a late spring. Whenever someone wanted to go out from the village, they went to the weather person to ask them about the weather report. The weather person was always ready to tell what the weather would be to anyone. The weather person had to be right. They had to make the right report all the time. If they made mistakes, no one would believe them anymore. They had to be a good weather person. When the weather person said the coming spring season would be good to hunt seals, they told people they had better go out to the coast before it was too late for good hunting. They told the people it was going to be a late spring. Most of the people nearby would hear what the weather person had to say. Before we move to the next slide, I want to point out that the way that storytellers identify the seasons is often different than the way that we understand them today in the colonized worlds that we live in. I say worlds because although, we all live on the same planet, sometimes we live in different worlds in our minds, in our social circles, in our cultures, in our bodies, in our families. And I say this because I have read accounts of elders talking about fall, and what it sounds like is winter. You notice here that there isn't a word for fall identified, at least on this slide, and they do talk about winter. Earlier they talk about autumn. So I want to identify that there were different understandings of what the seasons were first. And the second thing is, throughout different periods of history, climate and seasonal change was very, very different. There were periods on Earth that were very different than what we understand now, colder periods, warmer periods. And so I encourage you not to apply season and change in the way that you might understand it today. Wisdom and the power of imagination. This particular information from the people of Kauwerak is an example of adaptive resilience, which, as resilience does, originates in the mind. I want to remind you before reading this slide that the text in this cultural learning resource is not taken in the order in which it was written. Before we dive into this section, I want to remind you that the old man is the prophet Iñupiat, and the young man that he is speaking to is Qquilluq. And so this was taken from earlier, and this was a long, long time ago. At this time, the old man told him, "I will give you wisdom and the power of imagination, because your Inuit people have none of these." And I want to remind people at this time that Inuit means the people. There was a time, possibly in pre-history as we understand it, history as we have it documented, that perhaps we didn't imagine the way that we do now that encourages innovation. And in our ancient history resources, in Inuit ancient history resources, we have record of this way of new thinking in our stories. You have to make every effort to teach them many things they have to learn to do to live in the changes to come. You must organize yourselves and struggle to live when this time comes. Now the people live without problems. Again, this is during the warm time that we referenced earlier, the time that there wasn't any war, there wasn't any suffering before the first earthquake. You will have to encourage them into a process so they will learn a new way of life. As an artist, I myself think of the creative process and this inspires me. When the climate changes, they will never know how to survive from destruction, unless they have wisdom and the power of imagination. That's my little add-on, of course. The earth will depart farther from the sun every month. Soon the sun will run behind the moon. This is an eclipse. This will be the first disaster. The whole land will see it. It will happen all of a sudden. No one will know when it will be. Even the birds and animals will not know. It will be all unexpected when it happens. And I want to point out here really quickly that it's not very straightforward what the first disaster is, at least when reading the People of Kauwerak in full. The eclipse has been listed as the first disaster and the earthquake as well. The old prophet continued teaching Qquilluq. He told him, "You must try to advance your learning and understanding, no matter what it is you are doing. Accept it and do it. You and your people will go through great difficulties and afflictions in time to come. One of these days, you and your people will find a new way to live. The present ways of life you are in will change. I tell you, before the changes come, you must prepare yourselves. This continent will be changed, and it is going to be a different country altogether. You and your people will have to begin to use your minds to think. If you are wise enough, you will come through." I consider this spiritual knowledge. I think about the many times that Inuit people and all peoples have gone through great difficulties and afflictions, and I've had to find new ways to live and how we've prepared ourselves. And I think we are always challenged to use our minds to think in new ways. Red tongue of fire. Suddenly, Qquilluq could feel the ground shaking underneath him. 3 times the shaking of the ground passed under his feet. Then he heard a roaring and a loud rumble. He looked back and saw that the great mountain was blowing up. The noise got worse and worse, and he began to get scared. A big black smoke came out from the top of the mountain. A terrible red tongue of fire came out of the smoke. At the same time, red-hot coals came out from the top and rolled down the side of the mountain toward the old place of his people. Qquilluq began to hear all kinds of confusion. He looked around and saw many kinds of birds and animals running and flying toward him. The animals were all running away together, big and small, and the birds sat in the air. As the animals passed, Qquilluq jumped up and rode on the back of a scared, stampeding bear. He held it tight by the neck so they could keep up with the other animals. There was so much noise from the birds in the air and the animals, he could not hear the noise of the mountain or anything else. I just want to take a moment here to note that Qquilluq listened to his spiritual guide, and Qquilluq listened to the environment. As a result, he was able to save his community. "Now," said the old prophet, "you are to become my servant so you may serve and lead your people. You must go beyond this mountain on a long journey." Qquilluq sat down face to face with Iñupiat Qquilluq. He looked around the place. He saw a great change. There was only black rock, like frozen water, everywhere. There was no kind of green living things around, and not even a bird or animal anywhere. He saw that the water was still running from the spring same as ever. The place seemed deserted. It was so quiet. Iñupiat Qquilluq raised his arm and pointed to a mountain in the far distance. They could just make it out with their eyes. The old man said, "You and someone should look into that distance. You will learn lots of things. It will be new to you. You will now have the power of imagination in your mind of things not present to your senses."